In the early morning hours of July 23, 1930, three men walked into a crowded hotel lobby and gunned down one of Detroit's most powerful and popular radio voices. A fitting exclamation point to a landmark week in the city, one that saw record gangland violence and the recall election of the city's mayor, only in office for 6 months. The brazen execution and the failure to indict the well-known suspects made front-page news across the country for months. But today, 85 years later, hardly anyone remembers the LaSalle Hotel, much less one of Detroit's crimes of the century.
Like I said, once we're done, if you wanted to go up and look at the graves, Gerry Buckley was a very popular radio commentator whose radio broadcast from a studio in Detroit's LaSalle Hotel. He considered himself a champion among the common man, or a common herd, as he liked to say.
Most people know him as a very prominent radio announcer in 1930. This is sort of the standard interpretation, a key role in the recall election of the mayor, Bowles.
Professor Tom Klug of Marygrove College, chair of the Detroit Studies program, has researched the Buckley murder extensively.
Bowles is recalled, and a few hours later, Gerry Buckley is assassinated. And so there's simply a lot of political drama around the man. As a radio announcer, though, he hadn't only been involved in denouncing Bowles, he denounced corruption and vice. But even beyond that, he also articulated things that would become more prominent in the 1930s. The need for ordinary people, the people he called the common herd, to have old age pensions, Social Security, unemployment benefits. I think one of the great things about what's happening in 1930 is that as Detroit explodes in violence and political mayhem, and then when it culminates with the assassination of Buckley, at a point where people say, oh my God, we gotta stop this thing, how did we get like this? You gotta realize 10 years earlier, Detroit's elite rode a wave of reform to change Detroit once and for all and to purify it, to make it the city on the hill. They passed prohibition in Michigan. It failed in Detroit, but they passed it in Michigan, and then nationwide, the country becomes officially dry.
Right, Michigan leads the way.
Right, and they also in 1918 reformed the city charter, created a strong mayor, and they got rid of the ward political system. And the ward political system had empowered the aldermen, whose power was based in those districts controlled by saloon dealers.
Right.
That was the argument.
Right.
And the immigrants and the working man. So Detroit was viewed as a den of corruption. We're going to clean that up, abolish the ward system. We're going to have a small city council or common council, and each member is going to be elected at large. So you can't just be some rinky-dink local person with some saloon dealer bankrolling you. You have to have sizable support and reputation, a big name, and who does better than probably the elite or their candidates. Right. So with this political reform and or repression, some people call it, together with the crusade against booze, so the saloon dealers are getting whacked in two ways. Right. Wipe out the saloons and neutralize their political influence. The thought was that Detroit, once and for all, like other cities, is going to be purified.
I am not here to make trouble. I am only here to make a suggestion. I explained to them that a new time was beginning in Detroit. It was something big, and they could be part of it if they so chose. Why not come be a part of this purple gang of mine?
In 2010, author Warren Berger published his novel The Purples, a fictionalized account of Joe and Ray Bernstein, the leaders of Detroit's notorious Purple Gang, and their struggles against a crusading radio reporter based on the life and murder of Gerry Buckley.
So The Purples is really mainly about the Purple Gang, but there are two other characters who are very prominent in it, aside from the members of the Purple Gang. One being the character of Harry Riley, based on Harry Kelly, who worked in the Wayne County District Attorney's Office, had a run-in with the Purple Gang and sort of tried to take them on at one point. He also happens to be my wife's grandfather, and Harry Kelly eventually became the governor of Michigan. But in the meantime, sort of off to the side, you've got this character of Gerry Buckley. I actually called him Gerry Buckley in my novel. I wanted to change his name slightly because there were things I said about the Buckley character that may not have been exactly true about Gerry Buckley. So I felt probably wasn't fair to use his name. But I did pretty much follow what I knew about Buckley, including a lot of his life and his death and some of the things he said. To me, he represented the first, one of the first real media celebrities. You know, he was a guy that obviously became famous on the radio before that kind of thing was happening that much. And he was kind of a pundit, you know, in those times, and had a lot of power over the people of Detroit, but was also became a somewhat polarizing figure.
Last night, while we were on the air, a phone call came into the office. It was one of those anonymous phone calls, as they generally are. These phone calls are as such a character as to contain a threat. And there was a threat last night. In these days, threats are humorous. It was a threat over the phone. Our brave man of the telephone asked a question. He said, "We continually use the word we. We wish to answer that question this evening." The word is used editorially. It is used because the expression I is obnoxious. So my brave lad of the telephone, who deftly hides behind the wires and nickel slots of the telephone, don't take it out on anybody except the speaker. We, I, reiterate, are solely responsible for this period.
There's a lot of mist swirling around, but as far as I understand it, he began on the radio around 1928 or 1929. Roughly around the same time as a very famous radio personality also gets on the air up in Royal Oak, Father Charles Coughlin. Yeah. The radio is the brand new technology of the decade, and Detroit is almost kind of ground zero for this, the evolution of radio programming.
You got a good tone for what his voice was like and his manner. And I think the way I perceived him was he saw himself as the voice of the people. So he was telling them, it was almost like, you're my flock, and I'm going to tell you what you should think about what's happening now. And I think, looking at his messages, a lot of positive stuff about, almost power to the people kind of stuff. There was some negative stuff too, though, in his words. He seemed to do some scapegoating of groups and people in Detroit, and he was kind of into that, into saying we should be really mad at these people, or these people over here are causing some of the problems in Detroit.
There are big gaps in the records. We don't seem to have the personal papers or records of Gerry Buckley. There's quite a bit of newspaper coverage, certainly during the recall campaign and the trial. But you then have to plow through all the various newspapers to be able to do that. And the Detroit newspapers, unfortunately, are not indexed.
Early in the morning of July 23rd, 1930, he was brutally shot to death by a mafia gunman as he sat reading the paper in the LaSalle lobby.
It definitely, or it seemed to clearly involve the mob in some way, that was unclear exactly, why or how they were involved. But it became an interesting sort of turning point for my book, which, following the Purple Gang, because it was sort of it was a turning point in Detroit, I think. It was a period when the crime, which had gotten so rampant, suddenly reached kind of a tipping point. When you have this public assassination of one of the most famous people in the city, I think everyone realized that, things had really gotten out of hand. And it was at that point they really seemed to crack down on the gangs and drove a lot of the gangsters out of business right after that.
These young guys, the gunmen, were parked outside of the hotel. It was down on Woodward. I think it was later called the Detroiter Hotel. He was parked out in front of it. They were parked in front when he came in. He sat in a wing chair in the lobby, and then one of them came in and gunned him down. The police cars had just gotten radios, were able to communicate between each other. And for some reason, the radios weren't working. At least in that neighborhood, they weren't working.
So when I've had students work on this as a project, I said, there are a number of ways to approach it. Tell me the story of Gerry Buckley before he became well known. How did he get into radio? What was his role? What's the connection I always hear between Buckley and Ford? Is a political arrangement? What is it that Buckley said that made him popular? What was his style and so forth? But then also tell me the story of what happens in the aftermath. Not only the election that brings Murphy to office, but also the trial.
A year after the murder of Gerry Buckley, 5,000 Detroiters gathered here on Belle Isle to listen to Mayor Frank Murphy. As Professor Tom Klug points out, Frank Murphy was in the vanguard of the social change that Gerry Buckley inspired in Detroit and its citizens.
Because after Mayor Bowles is recalled, there's an election for mayor. And Bowles runs again against 4 or 5 other candidates. One of the other candidates is Frank Murphy. He had a lot of support among African Americans. Of course, he was the presiding judge in Wayne County during the Ocean Suite trial in the mid-20s. Murphy, of course, was very connected to immigrants and the various ethnic groups, Poles, Jews, Hungarians, and that was his political base, and organized labor to the extent it was there. They looked to Murphy as well.
So there was a lot of ethnic mixing going on. There was a lot of stuff bubbling up in Detroit at that time. It was such a fascinating time for the city. And I felt like, Buckley was kind of the guy who was seeing it all and commenting on it all and talking about what was going on in the city at that time.
We presume that most of you have voted ere this, and if you have not, don't miss your vote today. The vote is running heavy, very, very heavy, and you don't wish to miss your shake in our government. For the present and future good of Detroit, we recommend a yes vote. As long as you insisted on the recall, take advantage of it. You can settle who is to be mayor definitely in the election to follow. Otherwise, as we do not hesitate to say again, this being a war of extermination, the political war in Detroit, will continue.
In 1985, the LaSalle Hotel was imploded to make way for modern condominiums, erasing one of the last physical reminders of Detroit's mob history. History is being made in Detroit every day, so keep watching, and we'll keep digging.